think I see some folks who it is evening for you, so thanks for joining us on a Saturday night. All right, I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes for folks to make their way in. As usual, if you would like to let our speaker know where you're joining from, you can type it in the chat there. And yeah, the usual notes. If you ask a question during the session, just be aware that it is being recorded and live streamed, so your name might appear in the recording if you ask a question. And other than that, we are now on day 9 of the Festival of Indigenous Languages, so I think y'all know the routine. And so let's just go ahead and get started. I am delighted and honored to introduce our speaker, Dr. Prem Phyak, tonight. He is a fellow PhD alum of the University of Hawaii at Manoa and now teaching at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And his research areas include language policy, multilingualism, language ideology, teacher education, and the sociolinguistics of Indigenous and minoritized languages. He's published papers in various journals, such as Language Policy, Language in Society, and International Journal of the Sociology of Language. And I will say, speaking personally, I think his work is really exciting and fruitful and points us to a lot of paths forward for work in Indigenous languages around the world. So it is our absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Prem Phyak.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anna, and for having me. So I think I can share my slide now, right? Thanks. Okay, is it fine? So thanks. Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining me. My name is Prem Phyak. I'm from Nepal. So I think I should really start off with introducing myself in my mother tongue, my first language, that is Limbu. So one of the indigenous languages in Nepal. So maybe I will translate later. So so anga ming Prem Phyak. So anga na Nepal lam ilam laje mebatu. So anjay anga kon Nepal's indigenous languages ha aklorik unchi status and what helen pan memisak anga share jogum. So what I'm basically saying is I'm from Nepal, so I will be sharing with you some recent work that I have been doing and the current status of indigenous languages, particularly discourses around language endangerment in Nepal. So my title is basically going beyond linguicentrism, creating space for indigenous languages and resisting the dangerous discourse of language endangerment in Nepal. So I will begin with my personal history. I believe that personal is political because any language, any stories related to language, particularly indigenous languages, has political issues. So I was born and raised in a Yakthung, a Limbu family and community in a rural village of eastern Nepal. And Limbu was my dominant language in the family. It was the primary language of socialization in the community until I finished my secondary education. I used to speak Limbu with my grandparents, parents, aunties, siblings, and neighbors when I was in the village. So just to give you a brief introduction of Limbu or Yakthung language, it is spoken by around 1.3% of total population in Nepal. So it has its own script. So this is called Sirijanga script, and the language has actually its written literature, for example, dictionaries, textbooks, and even like multimedia resources, for example, some films and music, and so on. Yet, just to highlight my schooling during the regime of one nation, one language ideologies, when I was doing my primary schooling in a rural village, language education policy was shaped by the ideology of the panchayat regime, which is one of the specific regimes in Nepal that actually promoted the whole project of linguistic nationalism and actually re-strengthened one nation, one language ideologies particularly through language education policies. And the medium of instruction was solely in Nepali, and languages other than Nepali were actually banned in schools and other public spheres as well. And I was part of that during my primary schooling. Textbooks, exams, and classroom interactions were all in Nepali. Indigenous languages were seen as a problem for linguistic nationalism, so broader discourses around language and language issues were actually framed from more linguistic nationalist perspective. In that, Nepali was promoted as the national language, and indigenous children were actually in schools and still now are positioned as languageless subjects. And a lot of I myself feel that, how we self-censor our own language practices, although we wanted to speak languages. So by the time I finished my schooling, Nepali was already the dominant language of my everyday repertoire. And then I gradually began to understand the ideological space of indigenous languages, because I had to leave the village to pursue my certificate after schooling and bachelor's education in district headquarters. I was still speaking Limbu with my Limbu friends in the college, although they were not actually used as a medium of instruction, or they were not taught in colleges. And then during that time, the panchayat regime was ended, and by the people's movement, and this multi-party democratic system was restored. And basically, I started kind of like listening to ethno-linguistic consciousness and the discourse of indigenous languages and cultural rights in the public discourses once the political regime was changed. And the different, formation of different indigenous organizations, for example, Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, which is the umbrella organization of indigenous people in Nepal, had different campaigns actually. For one of the campaigns was language literacy and cultural revitalization, including intangible cultural heritages. And this organization is really active now. So I had to move from a village to now Kathmandu, the capital city, for my higher education. I felt that by that time, I felt that I was losing Limbu, and I use it only when I return to home during vacations. And after completing my master's, I had a job in a university, and I could not use it in the university, as you know, because it was not part of curriculum, and it was not actually it was not really used because I didn't have many friends who use Limbu. So as I understand the ideological space of indigenous languages, there were kind of emergence of ethnic organization after the political change. For example, the establishment of Kirat Yakthung Chumlung, which is again national organization of Limbu indigenous people. Actually, in Nepal, so such organizations have played really critical role in revitalizing indigenous languages. So such organizations, almost all ethnic organizations or indigenous people communities have their own organization, national organization, actually register as community organization. And these organization, for example, Kirat Yakthung Chunlung of the Limbu people have been really active in promoting language literacy and language rights and cultural rights, even political rights-based activities across the country. So as I was in Kathmandu, so for my higher education and also later as a teacher, so I had opportunity to observe and participate in the discussions on collective indigenous activism, language rights, cultural rights, and mother tongue education. That was much really of my interest, and multilingual policies. And I was like beginning to read constitution and educational policy documents that were never discussed throughout my education up to master's degree. So that was really kind of systemic eraser of how such critical issues were not really much discussed in education policies. But, as I, outside of my university, so, there was different kind of space for me to understand the ideological space of indigenous languages. So now looking back, so how did I build really critical ideological awareness from the bottom up? As I said, it's not my education that helped me understand all these policy issues. But after I completed my master's degree, I started working as a teacher educator and talked to teachers and students across the countries. And I had visited a number of schools and observed their language practices, actually. And I had more dialogic engagement with communities and indigenous youth, particularly the indigenous youth organizations. For example, Limbu Students Forum, and there are the Forum of Indigenous students in different campuses across the country, which is very, I think, in a way, which is very positive for indigenous activism, because there are students forum in as far as possible in different campuses, and they have been really active in promoting these language rights discourses. So as I start talking with communities and indigenous youth, there was big political change actually in 2006. The whole history of monarchy was kind of ended, and we kind of now adapted actually more federal policies, structure of the nation states in that identity policy, and particularly language rights and preservation and promotion of indigenous languages. All these issues have been a major debates, and still the new constitution that was actually promulgated in 2015 recognizes indigenous language rights, mother tongue education, all these things. But the point is how these things are not actually receiving more spaces in practice, particularly in education and the public spaces. So as I talk to these communities and participate in discussion, I become more like understand that how language is taken as a major part of collective identities of the indigenous communities. So as I understand these things more, I move forward, and particularly I'm really convinced with the fact that we really need to decolonize the ideologies that we have actually embraced in language education policies, or in language policies in general, or even our common practices of language, indigenous language revitalization in education. So that's why I started really understanding how these things would work with communities, particularly in schools where actual language practices are seen. So I focused my research on why indigenous languages were not really receiving space in education in the public sphere. So mostly in my doctoral and now ongoing research. So I basically asked this question. Even if there are ideological spaces at the nation states, for example, constitution, as I said before, the new constitution of 2015. So why Indigenous languages hardly receive space in public sphere, such as schools, universities, workplaces, even government and non-government organization. So it basically questions the limitations of language rights at some point, actually. Um, so just to mention, so in any special issue that I and Peter de Costa had edited for language, Journal of Language, Identity and Education, actually we have discussed this issue, how language rights may not be always sufficient, particularly in this neoliberal regime, to actually reclaim and revitalize indigenous languages. And maybe what should we be, having in terms of both discourses and our strategies to work with communities. So then I started, talking with communities particularly. I was not really much interested in more like talking with macro level policymakers, because it was not really productive. It was more like the same thing repeating again and again. So, but talking with communities was really powerful in terms of understanding the complexities of indigenous languages. So talking with communities, I learned that the revitalization of indigenous languages is more than a linguistic endeavor. It is about reclaiming indigenous history, culture, place, epistemologies that have been erased by colonial ideologies enforced through national policies and discourses on socio-political and economic development. So as long, it's very interesting to see how the discourse of development, so basically development as more economic development, infrastructural development, actually just sideline the issue of language education or indigenous languages. Just to give an example of sustainable development goal, right? So that Nepal has actually endorsed that and working on that goals, but I don't quite explicitly see how language education or indigenous languages are part of that development goals. So I feel that it's really important to unpack ideologies, language ideologies, mostly the coloniality of language ideologies that shape our school spaces and other public spaces, for example, including our mentality of what counts as language education. So then I really work on this notion of engaged research with my doctoral supervisor, Kathy Davis. Unfortunately, she passed away. So I talk about engaged language policy, basically, and the point that we are making is language policy research. It's not just about understanding what counts as language policy, but also is an effort to engage communities and multiple actors to explore, understand, resist, and even transform unequal language policies. So there are different levels of transformation. And as a researcher working with the communities, it's really important to understand the complexities, not only understand ourselves, but also engage communities in understanding, exploring, resisting, and transforming unequal language policies. So I will basically talk about very quickly how some of my activities, some of my projects kind of inform this engaged research. So basically informed by decolonizing methods of Linda Smith and decoloniality by the scholars from Global South, for example, Guyano, Santos, who talk about how language policies, mainstream language, dominant language policies actually erase indigenous epistemologies and values. So basically, my project is more like, so I draw on more like critical theories, a number of critical theories, including Paulo Freire and some other critical theories for Linda Smith. So I call it more like dialogic engagement with indigenous parents and teachers. So I can't really talk about the whole project, but basically I will just focus on one school. So in this project, so I basically work with the communities and teachers. So observing classes, and running workshops based on the observation that we have seen in schools, for example, and community dialogue based on ethnographic observation. So when I say ethnographic observation, so there's nothing like, me serving as an expert, but rather, so drawing on the ethnographic observation from schools and communities. So basically focus on language practices, how language teaching and learning, how teaching and learning in general takes place in schools in absence of indigenous languages, for example, right? So it's just like not giving something that is not really, that is beyond their scope. So, but building on what we have actually seen in communities and schools, and just kind of understand how what we have seen in the schools and communities in terms of language or knowledge are actually critical to discuss. So just for example, I call it like river school. So this school had introduced Limbu as a subject of teaching in 1999. So based on the mother tongue education policy of the government. So according to that policy, the communities can actually, schools and basically they call it like school management committee, but in a way it's kind of is community, and schools and community can work together and decide which one of the indigenous languages could be taught as one of the subjects at primary level. So in this school, the community, so most of the parents are, I think more than 90% parents are Limbus, and most students are Limbus in this school. So they decided to introduce Limbu as a subject of teaching. And as I said, the organization of Limbu people called Yakthung Kirat Yakthung Chungnung had worked with the schools to introduce the mother tongue education. Actually, this organization has their different branches in different villages throughout the country. So the program was discontinued, but unfortunately, the program was discontinued in 2012 to introduce an additional English and English as a medium of instruction. So it has very historical reason in a way, and we discuss with teachers and parents, and they keep telling us that, like, there is a division between private and public schools, and English is a de facto medium of instruction in private schools. So, and the most parents are sending their kids to private schools, mostly those who could pay some tuition and other fees in private schools. So now EMI policies are also copied by public schools throughout the country, because they would they need to really compete. That is what they keep telling us in our dialogue. And English is seen as an indicator of quality education. So this is basically coming from these teachers. But what is happening is the students hardly understand the lessons of social studies, science, environment, mathematics, and even English, because everything is in English, right? You can imagine that a student who speaks Limbu and Nepali in family, in community, and when he comes to school, and if he is taught in English, which is never used in the community, and from the first day of his schooling, so you could imagine, so how they would learn things like, very abstract concepts of social studies like family, neighborhood, and all those things. So, and we basically discuss these issues with the teachers and parents. And schools mostly misframe what parents think about education. They keep telling us that, okay, parents, they keep telling me that, okay, it's because parents want English, right? But when talking with the parents, I know that, like, parents want English, but not really English medium of instruction. They don't think that they should be teaching everything in English medium of instruction. But the schools think that, they misframe that, just because parents need English, so they have to introduce English as a medium of instruction. Actually, English as a required, a compulsory subject from the first grade. So parents, basically what happens in this dialogue, so the parents are not really consulted. Parents who actually had a struggle to introduce Limbu in school was not consulted, and parents would like to restart Limbu teaching after a series of discussion. Actually, they agreed. For example, even the teachers also become aware of how English medium does not help students learn effectively. So they basically started questioning the whole relevance of English medium of instruction in that particular school context, because the first they also question their own proficiency because it doesn't really work. So the only thing is it's very ideological because it's seen as an indicator of quality education, which is very mythical actually. So even parents become critical and critical about the monolingual mentality of the school. So most parents think that it's just like continuation of what they have seen before, during the panchayat regimes. So with this, I would like to move on to another project. So that was more like critical engagement and then helping teachers and parents understand how, policies they have introduced in the school is not really meaningful for the community's children and how it is more ideological. So more ethnographic oriented dialogue. So another project was engaging youth, basically from learning from the elders. So it's pretty straightforward project. So in this project, so I worked with a group of primary students who have very little knowledge of Limbu actually. So they have gone through language shift. Even their parents hardly speak Limbu. So the students basically in this project, the students visit the community elders and listen to their stories. Mostly the stories are folk tales they tell in Limbu, and sometimes their own personal life world. For example, childhood memories, how they survive now, their food, everything. So youth asks various questions in both Limbu and Nepali. So as you see in the photo, it was taken around in, I think, 2015. They also note down the keywords and stories and later write in both Limbu and Nepali. So in schools, then we discuss what they have basically written. So what they have learned from these community elders. And these keys are really interesting. So they talk about how it is really important, not only important to understand not only Limbu folktales, but also folktales and words, but also the whole life world of this, the elders. Actually, they understand the whole life histories of these community elders through the folktales and Limbu words, for example. So in a sense, like these youths are actually taking their roles as learner at the same time. At the same time, they also kind of develop kind of critical awareness about how the language, the learning of the Limbu language is really important to understand their grandparents, right? So this is my own family project. Actually, she is my daughter. We really asked her to, she's really motivated to learn Limbu, because in her schools, they don't really teach Limbu and any indigenous languages, right? So we basically asked her to, in family, we asked her to like counting in 3 different languages, even writing, also telling basic literacy. Now she has basically started. It's been almost 2 years now.
One, two, three, four, five, six, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah, thank you. So basically, she is learning both literacy, writing, as well as counting numbers. And we have started with even the days and months, and also basic things that we use in our, for example, in family, for example, food and culture and other stuffs. So also drawing. So it's been really useful way to really engage with young kids who have never been exposed to indigenous languages in schools, just because, as I said, although there is the whole discourse of language rights, but they are not really actually implemented in school spaces. So now, this is another project that with this, now this is more like a macro level project that I have been doing, working with journalists, local governments, teachers and teacher educators and parents. So basically, as I have said, although there is whole discourse of mother tongue education and language rights and multilingual education, but in education policy practice, particularly in schools. So as I said, there is an increasing trend of using English as a medium of instruction, and the indigenous languages, and local languages and other minoritized languages are not really getting space in education. So that's why, so I have actually worked with journalists in collaboration with the education journalist group and local communities, and had kind of nationwide dialogue and very open. My role as a facilitator and discussant, and basically I share the importance of indigenous language and knowledge and multilingualism in education. And in this space, like they come like even the representative of local government, and then teachers, parents, and educators and social workers in local communities are invited, and they just discuss the conditions, how language is critical issues in their schools, so why they are adapting, for example, EMI policies, and why they are not really able to use, implement mother tongue education or mother tongue based multilingual education. So all these things are very open dialogue. So, and it's very productive to see, how this kind of dialogue with multiple actors open up space for indigenous languages in education. Particularly, they understand the tensions in terms of socio-political, educational, and social justice perspectives, for example, right? So, for example, the mayor of one of the municipalities says, oh yeah, we have decided to introduce English as a medium of instruction in all public schools because we have to compete with private schools. And in the same as to respond, for example, there may be a social worker or maybe a representative from indigenous community. Oh, wow, this is, yeah, it's okay, but what about the using indigenous languages in education, right? And as the dialogue really continues, so my role basically is to tell or to share what actually research findings have shown, and how do we actually create a space for all languages in education. So it's very rewarding experience, and I'm actually working on this. So basically, the whole project actually builds awareness, particularly in terms of what is actually documented in constitutions, even in education policies, and also understanding what evidence research findings have identified. Why is it important to have like mother tongue education in schools, for example, right? So what lessons did I learn? So I conclude with this, and I conclude with this kind of like provocative, but the dangerous discourse of language endangerment. So what I see basically is why there is a big gap between policies and the ideological space and more, as Nancy Hunberger says, implementational spaces, right? So one thing that I see is this kind of deficit ideologies. So this is what one of the quotes, like indigenous communities are not aware of the value of their own language. That's actually very dominant discourse that I hear when I talk to people from all over the country. So, and but my point is, like, linguists, politicians, educators, and even we teachers are not really aware and not even interested in discussing the historical inequalities supported by nation states a lot in many ways, and the coloniality of Western ideologies in education. So, but rather we just dismiss these historical inequalities by telling that, you know, indigenous communities are not aware of the value of their own language. So in other words, it's kind of like blaming the victims. So the dominant discourses often blame indigenous communities and parents for not speaking their languages, but it doesn't mean that they don't really like to speak languages. They would like to, but there are structures, there are systems that does not really, or ideologies that actually do not really allow spaces for indigenous languages. So very quickly, so I would argue that this kind of forgetting for me is not really ignorance, rather it is a political tool that dismisses how indigenous communities have gone through the histories of cultural imperialism, oppressive political regimes, and erasures of their epistemology. So this is basically missing in the talking of in the talks and discussions of language education policies and even language revitalization efforts. So another discourse that I hear is like indigenous people do not speak and use their languages at home. So they are not really interested to teach their children in mother tongue schools. So it's another discourses that we hear. So, but as I have shown the video of my own daughter learning Limbu, so how interested she is, right, to learn, and you know, all indigenous communities are really interested in teaching and in learning, but we have never seen what we have done basically to create spaces for these languages. So for me, like, home is just one of the domains of language use. And children spend most of their time in schools and doing school-related activities at home. But we have never questioned whether we have created a space for indigenous languages in school. So most of the time, for example, except for the weekend, so my daughters, for example, and maybe this is for all of us, she spends doing homework, maybe given by schools, and that is not in indigenous languages. So, and it's really important for us to question, so how language policy in education actually influences family language policies as well, right? So there are a number of significant studies on that. So what lessons did I learn? So I think the last one, I think the most important one, is the standard language ideologies, which is very, very significant. So even I hear that particularly from you know, from the people who are really involved in this kind of efforts, particularly documentation and language revitalization, which is important. But indigenous kind of like reproducing in standard language ideologies. For example, indigenous languages cannot be used in education because they do not have a standard writing system. So which is actually very diminishing in other sense, like focusing more on writing system, not necessarily on indigenous oral practices, right? So this kind of ideology erases the oral indigenous languages practices, and it's very divisive. Actually, it divides the indigenous people as well, because they have very kind of, in other words, maybe we can call it like dialectical differences or regional differences. That kind of diversities are really ignored in, for example, we can give a lot of examples of textbooks written in indigenous languages. So that could be another questions that we need to really ask ourselves. So, and as I discussed, like, education is an important space for indigenous language revitalization, but the question is, schools and universities continue to shut down, closed down the space for indigenous languages till they continue to embrace neoliberal ideology. So as I have briefly highlighted, so the whole English medium of instruction policy has been very popular just because historically private schools were actually allowed to use English as a medium of instruction, even though the nation states had mother tongue education policy. So they were special, they were privileged to have their own policies. So this kind of neoliberalism continue to shape a university and school policies. I don't think that the education is still important, right? I'm talking about mainstream education. So as I said, children spend most of their time in schools and doing activities. Schools assigns them beyond school hours. If schools don't develop and implement policies that recognize and implement indigenous languages, values, epistemologies, arts, histories, and culture, we can't trust in schools and universities, honestly. So unfortunately, mainstream schools, both public and private, do not seem to embrace the value of indigenous languages. And we are celebrating the decade of international indigenous languages. I think that's a very, so finally, so we need to really have this decolonizing efforts. This is just a kind of reference if you are interested to read a special issue that I and Peter de Costa edited, a Journal of Language, Identity, and Education. So we basically highlight the different perspectives that we need to really take on discussing indigenous language education at the time of neoliberal era. So basically, here are some reflections. So we linguists, researchers, teacher educators should stop telling indigenous communities that we preserve and revitalize their languages. Rather, we should listen to them and understand how their lands, culture, values, epistemologies, and histories were colonized and even erased from the public spares. We must change our ways of working with indigenous communities. Positioning ourselves as an expert without understanding the oppressive histories will reproduce colonial ideologies and disregard indigenous epistemologies. We also need to work with communities, but we need to understand the fact that language revitalization or documentation or language education policies is a long-term community building project when it comes to the issue of indigenous languages and minoritized languages, with a strong commitment to support indigenous communities in their struggles to reclaim their linguistic, cultural, and political rights. The issue around indigenous languages are less linguistic in nature, but more political and historical, as my projects have actually highlighted. Any attempt to revitalize indigenous languages without addressing their political and historical issues is a failed effort to create a space of indigenous languages in the public sphere. So I conclude with Bernard Spolsky's concept, how he questions us to go beyond linguicentrism. So he argues, while many scholars are now beginning to recognize the interaction of political and other factors with language, it is easy to ignore them when we concentrate on language matters. Language is important, and any studies that exclude language are limited, but language and language policy need to be looked at in the widest context and not as a closed universe. And language is a central factor, but linguicentrism, absolute focus on just language only, imposes very limited vision of understanding indigenous language issues. So Nogen, and thank you very much for listening to me. If you have any questions, so I will be more than happy to answer. Thank you, Anna. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Prem, for this amazing talk. I would like to open the floor to questions or comments if anyone has any. I see we have some YouTube viewers too, so if we get any questions over there, I will read them for you as well. But we have one first question. Do you see this community organizing by ethnic organizations that you mentioned as playing a critical role in Indigenous language revitalization, as impacting attitudes and national language policy? In other words, we hear how national policy influences the local level, but how does the local organizing impact the national situation, the attitudes, discourses, and policies?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think it's the relationship between local and, I mean, these communities and national policies are always, in many cases, like they exist in like linear fashion. So they tend to, these community organizations tend to really depend on what national policies tell them. But at the same time, at the same time, even if there are policies, they basically are not really able to translate into practice as well, right? So I think it's not really a straightforward answer, but what I see basically is at the bottom, from more like political perspective, these organizations have been really really active in terms of ensuring rights, language rights in documents, for example, constitutions, right, and education policies. And there is whole history, particularly from 1990 to now, so until now. So these communities have been really active to lobby political parties and to give pressure to Ministry of Education and other concerning agencies to actually ensure that their any issues related to language or indigenous languages are actually included in policy documents. But as I said, I think it's really important for all these communities actually to work. Because I focus more on bottom up, like grassroots communities. It's really important for communities to focus on the local, more grassroots level spaces. For example, particularly my focus is on schools, which is not been really more meaningful these days. But again, it's not really I can't really generalize, but there are some kind of local. Look, these organizations have their own local units as well. Throughout the country, where they have different, where they have their own settlements in terms of number of population. So they have been very active. Some local units have been very active to work with local government and even schools to put pressure on, they don't have to put pressure on, they just have to remind them that, okay, this is what policy says and you have to really implement it. But, as I said, the whole discourses of this neoliberalism, the discourse of education as kind of like quality education, even the education as development, all these discourses are actually in many ways, I don't know whether it is right to use term like pacifying all this momentum and activism and voices. There are so many things, actually, multiple actors playing in the process of actually making this kind of activism meaningful in terms of implementing indigenous languages in schools. Yes, but I would say that in general, these community organizations have been very active. I think they, because they work together. So there are more than, let's say, I would say 59 different indigenous organizations, and there are more than 59, I would say. And so they come together actually when there is any issue of indigenous languages and indigenous language rights. But as I focus more on education, I don't really still quite see, right? And my case study actually showed that they have actually discontinued even the teaching of Limbu as a mother tongue in schools, just because they would like to introduce English, but they have actually misframed what parents wanted to see in schools. So yeah, I would say, like, in terms of ethno-linguistic consciousness or indigenous awareness, these communities have been really active. Yeah, particularly to put pressure on national level policies. But I still see that there are a lot to do in local level. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually have a question, if you don't mind, that touches on what you just mentioned. So it's really neat to hear that there is so much collaboration between the grassroots indigenous groups within Nepal. There's a lot of collaboration nationally. And have you noticed a lot of international collaboration, a lot of reaching out to indigenous movements in other countries, or a desire for that?
Yeah, a lot, actually. I would say there are different international NGOs and INGOs, even, for example, I would say like UNESCO and UNICEF, and yeah, these organizations are actually working and together with communities. But the only thing that I'm really concerned with this kind of model is like, at some point, for example, what happens basically when developmental agency come into community and work with these communities is like, maybe they are left alone later, right? So not really long-term plan. How does it work, right? For example, and also the issue of access, right? The whole symbolic meaning that we carry with ourselves. As I have said, we see ourselves as an expert. We tell them that we preserve their languages. We help them, I'm kind of like, I sound like more cynical, but that's true, right? So because the way we work with the communities, the way we kind of discourse, right? We talk to them in a way positions that, yeah, I think we need to wait for some experts, or we need to, follow what our experts will tell us, but not really so much to do in terms of like translating or recognizing their own activism, right? They have really a strong sense of activism. So I think for me, there are really wonderful collaborations internationally, actually. And as you have said, I have seen like, just to give some examples. But as I said, still, it's very important to see how these schools would really create, kind of both ideological and implementational spaces for Indigenous languages. I think, yeah, that's very critical issue. So we have done like a lot of language documentation, revitalization projects are going on, but still it's not just linguistic act, right? So for me, education is really important space, but as it is going on now, I don't quite see a lot of kind of positive indications in the future, for example. Yeah, sounds pessimistic, but there are good signs as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that nuanced answer.
Okay.
I have another question. What kinds of shifts of language ideology have you seen around Indigenous languages in the last decade, both in Nepal and globally? And how do you think your dialogues with different stakeholders have affected those discourses?
Yeah, I think that's very good question. So thank you very much for asking. Basically two things. So I would see that there is growing, kind of consciousness towards more decolonizing efforts, right? And I would say that we have been like kind of shifting. We are shifting from more like language rights to maybe more kind of community right oriented kind of ideologies. Also, in terms of like in terms of understanding the values, I think there is growing consciousness, particularly. I can give you two examples. So one example is these transnational indigenous communities, right? For example, indigenous communities in Nepal have been, in different parts of the world now. So this technology has given a lot of affordances, like spaces for example, documenting languages and uploading on the website, right? And even the musics and even the films and working really well, actually, in many ways, actually. So there is growing shift, particularly to give an example of Nepal. So there is really growing shift towards more positive ideologies about indigenous languages. And as I said, it's more like being more decolonial. But globally speaking, I would still think that, we are still more maybe linguicentrist, just focusing on language, which is okay. I mean, we have been doing, and it's really important work, but I don't quite still see that, how kind of like spaces, for example, education and then public spaces are still not really kind of embracing this the indigenous languages. And particularly, I'm really concerned with the way education, the schools and universities are actually closing down in many ways, right? The spaces for indigenous languages. So speaking of like education, language education policies, I don't, there are efforts, for example, Hawaii, Maori, but in many parts of the world, like in Nepal, and maybe other parts of the world. So I don't quite see that education universities have been really open and really embracing this kind of indigenous values and epistemologies. Yeah, I think, and my efforts, and it's just like I'm still, it's a very tiny project, but for me, what is really important is not really positioning ourselves as an expert, just like, hey, working with the communities that we have access, or working with the people that we trust, for example, right? And just start dialogue. As my I kind of like dialogue sounds more like demanding, but in a way, dialogue for me is basically just starting with oral history and then and just telling our own experiences of languages, living with languages, and how we have kind of connections with our previous generations and the younger generations, and how it affects our life, including learning, actually, and identity formation. So I think I just wanted to understand these facts and see whether I can connect spaces, for example, family and schools. Particularly, my interest is in seeing the dynamics between family and schools, community and schools, because as I said, school is a space where younger generations actually, and even at home, they have to spending like more time, like in doing school-related homeworks. Even weekend, like my daughters are like kind of don't finish their homework, and they have to spend their time in the weekend as well. And all textbooks and all, activities are in not in indigenous languages, and we wish, and that is what we are telling, that it should be implemented, right? Not just should not exist in policy documents. It should be implemented in all the schools. That's more a structural and political thing, and that's why, for me, like I engage my daughters and kind of let's learn something, right? I engage with whatever I can do. So that's actually creating my own space as someone who does not understand or who does not know so many things, but would like to know from communities and discuss, not just as an expert, but someone who would like to do something with the communities. So I think it's more like bottom up. So I don't think that it's always perfect, but in many ways it works with small kind of communities and indigenous groups. Yeah, thank you. I think I'm not sure whether I answered this question, but yeah, it's not really straightforward answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I can't imagine there is a simple answer to that question.
Right.
Yeah, and I have, there's one final question that, again, is going to be a pretty complicated one that was brought up recently in the ELP Facebook group, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it, which is, what do you think speakers of Indigenous languages can expect from the upcoming decade of Indigenous languages? And I think that's sort of a two-part question, right? What can people expect in terms of perhaps high-level policy or broad international action? And what do you hope to see coming out of this decade? So both the realistic and the grand optimistic versions.
Yeah, I think the first thing for me is indigenous communities expect that we need to really critically review what we have done now, right? Until now, I would say, what are the things that were positive, that worked well, and what did not work well? Because we are, it's not just like indigenous kind of international decade, right? This issue is there before the formation of the nation states, right? So what I'm basically saying, that the first thing that we need to do, for me, I think for all indigenous language speakers and communities, is to review what we have done, very critically, honestly review what we have done, our ways of doing with the communities, and did work well and what did not really. And that's the first thing, and that would really give us kind of space for understanding what nation states have done, right? What different countries have done. Actually, there are very good examples even in Nepal. So there are good examples in terms of like policies, right? So we have the formation of language commissions, and then at least the constitutions and the documents say that you cannot discriminate people in terms of their language background. So things are there. But what is missing basically is kind of more community-based activities. When I say community-based activities, it's really important to recognize what communities can do, basically, and what and how they can be actually engaged in the process of capitalizing or utilizing what they have now, right? So basically what they have now is in terms of language, in terms of epistemologies, in terms of their ideological understanding as well, right? So I think that's the one thing that is very urgent for me, right? Because I don't think that indigenous communities are just like, they are not languageless or anything that they don't, I mean, they have many things, right? In many ways, right? The only thing that we need to do for me is really help them understand. I mean, they have understanding, but in other words, help them understand how these things are more political, ideological, and doable. Not really always like something that you have to talk about, but it is doable. I think for me, most important thing, as I always highlight, is education. Because, when you talk about language revitalization or language learning or language promotion or whatever, the first thing is you need to transfer from one generation to another generation, right? For example, my grandparents and my parents actually transfer this language to me, for example. But what happens now, as we see all over the world, is like the most children spend their time in schooling, right? Doing school-related activities in technology, virtually or physically, but there is no space. So when do you use your languages, for example? Even families have very different dynamics, right? You don't really have always time to talk with your kids, right? And see, this is really critical. So for me, that's why we need to really question universities, teacher education programs, and even schools and whoever are concerned with this. So I think in decade, like in this decade, for me, we need to really spend more time on teaching. When I say teaching, it doesn't have to be always like someone having like textbooks and teaching, but different kinds of teaching, right? So we need to really explore multiple creative ways of teaching, maybe using technology, producing materials, and transferring languages to younger generations, and engaging more to school administrators, for me, and which is very notorious space, I think. Yeah. So I think that is what I think I would really like to highlight. And another thing is, as I said, also we need to change our ways of working. So as I have highlighted in my talk, I mean, not always seeing ourselves as an expert, right? But I mean, we know something, but not really positioning ourselves as an expert would really be helpful with indigenous communities. In many ways, it may question their sovereignty and the sense of epistemological being, right? So, okay. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to highlight. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, Prem. And that really resonates. I think every year I spend working in the language revitalization space, I just realize how little I know to a greater and greater extent, right? It's like we're becoming less and less of an expert the more we actually do this work somehow. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you. I don't see any other questions. Let me just check YouTube. Yeah, I think we can give you a big virtual round of applause for this really rich and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you so much, Prem, for sharing your time and thoughts with us today. Virtual applause.
Okay, thank you, Anna, and in Endangered Language Project. So yeah, it was really wonderful.
I know when you were talking about the dangerous discourses of endangerment, I was like, don't look at our project name. Don't look at that.
yeah. Yeah. Okay, thank you
Yeah.
very much. Yeah, I appreciate it for your efforts, and thank you for having me. And yeah, I look forward to kind of having more discussions actually. Yeah.
Always, it is an ongoing discussion. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here with us. And tune in tomorrow morning. We will be hearing from another person in the policy space, Gerardo Garcia Chinchai, working in the Peruvian Ministry of Culture at the Directorate for Indigenous Languages. And also don't forget to tune in for Tracy Herbert's closing talk at 12 p.m. Pacific. We will be drawing raffle winners who will win one of 3 copies of the Routledge Handbook of Language Revitalization. So thank you again, Prem, and I hope we'll see you all tomorrow. Take care, everybody. Bye.